Wagwan, my people, it's grow with you, boys. Grow your mindset. My brothers don't need sushi. So for today's video, I'm gonna be explaining Putin's war on Ukraine. This guy is on a mad thing still. This guy came out of nowhere, shocked the world. This news is like literally the top news in the world right now. So obviously I had to make a video on it, innit? So it's mad. Let's get into it still. I'm gonna quote Putin saying, "I have made the decision to carry out a special military operation." But before we get into the details and all the juicy stuff, please, my people, make sure you subscribe if you're new to the channel, like the video, and comment in the section below about this war. What do you think is going on, fam? What do you think? Tell me more information about the war. If you have any new information, comment in the section below. So let's get into it.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Putin called this a special military operation. It's clearly a full war invasion. You get me?
Была паника, истерика, слезы.
Как у нас пламя было выше дома.
We're like in a cellar. I'm not sure if it's like deep enough to help us to survive.
Russian troops and tanks have entered Ukraine on all fronts. All these cities are under attack, including the capital of Kyiv, which has become Putin's main target. Many are sheltering in basements and metro stations across Ukraine. Fam, it's mad. Imagine sleeping in a metro station, fam, with your family in blankets. It's horrible, man. There have been many casualties, and over 500,000 of Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes. This right here, is one of Europe's largest wars since World War II, you get me? Since then, Europe's map has been shaped by political alliances. But now, Putin wants to redraw Europe's map by force, innit? He's not doing any negotiations or anything, fam. He's going in by force and by fire. Even though people have to die, innocent people, it's crazy. He's a monster.
Украина целиком и полностью была создана Россией.
Putin has long claimed that Ukraine belongs to Russia and they are one people.
We're not just close neighbors, we're one nation.
But Ukraine is a sovereign nation with its own language, political system. It's its own nation, fam. Well, the two countries do have a shared history, Russia and Ukraine, but Ukraine has fought long and hard for its independence. Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire in the 18th and 19th century. In 1917, the Russian Revolution brought down the empire, and this led to the regions spiraling into a civil war. Ukraine gained an independence but was quickly taken over by the newly created Soviet Union as one of its first republics. Over the next decade, the Soviet Union brutally expanded its control, you get me? And by the end of World War II, it forged a sphere of influence over here, while the West held its influence over here, essentially dividing Europe and marking the beginning of the Cold War, fam. The Soviet Union installed communist governments on their side, which were obviously easy for them to control. But the West developed in democracies with capitalist economies. The deep divide fueled distrust against both sides, and soon these fears hardened into military alliances. In 1949, these countries, along with the US and Canada, formed an alliance called NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and they promised to defend each other from invasions. A few years later, these countries joined the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact, and each side built up its military to protect themselves from each other. Europe remained this way for decades until one side finally collapsed. By late 1991, republics like Ukraine began to celebrate independence by Soviet domination. The Soviet Union dissolved into 15 independent countries, including a much weaker Russia, and the Soviet sphere of influence disappeared, as many countries overthrew their communist governments. Even though the Cold War ended, the alliance on the other side of Europe was still going strong. In fact, it was expanding. In 1999, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary joined NATO. And in 2004, 7 more countries joined. That moved NATO into the old Soviet sphere influence, making NATO's borders with Russia the longest it's ever been. Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia were now the last post-Soviet countries left between Russia and NATO. But Ukraine and Georgia both wanted to join NATO for a very long time. And that was what made them prime targets for Russia. You get me? Ukraine actually became a NATO partner in 1994, which brought them a step closer to becoming a member.
Україна буде в НАТО. Це історична подія для нашого народу.
And in 2013, they reached an association agreement with the European Union. But when it came time to sign the deal, Ukraine's pro-Russian government actually refused, did not sign the deal. Instead, they chose to strengthen ties with Russia. After the decision was announced, hundreds and thousands of protesters, they protested so they can demand the agreement to be signed, so Ukraine can actually join NATO. You get me? After months of peaceful protests, the Ukrainian president finally cracked down. He actually killed more than 100 people, and this obviously sparked more protests, which eventually President of Ukraine was actually voted out the country. Voted out his position and out the country. You get me? This actually meant Putin was losing political influence over Ukraine. So this is when he decided to use force instead. First, he invaded and annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula. Then, Russia-backed separatists captured the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk and actually declared them independent of Ukraine. Since then, Ukraine has been locked in a conflict with Russia that has killed 14,000 people and displaced nearly 2 million. For nearly 8 years, Putin has held on to these regions, destabilizing Ukraine and keeping it from moving closer to the west. But in November 2021, Putin decided to go all in. Satellites showed at least 100,000 Russian troops and military equipment piling up along the border of Ukraine. Putin repeatedly denied any plans to invade, but weeks later, he presented his demands to the West. His main demand was that NATO stop expanding and move its military borders back to where they were in 1997, away from Russia's. He wanted it far from Russia, you get me? But Western leaders rejected his demand. Instead, they put forces on standby and reinforced their military presence in the Eastern Europe. Back at Ukraine's border, Russian troops continued to gather. And over here, along its border with Belarus, Russia began conducting huge military drills. And obviously, on February 21st, the threat of war became real.
Считаю необходимым принять уже давно назревшее решение. Незамедлительно признать независимость и суверенитет Донецкой Народной Республики и Луганской Народной Республики.
Putin's troops immediately crossed the Ukrainian border. Ukraine announced a state of emergency, and President Zelensky made a direct appeal to the Russian people.
Война лишит гарантий всех. Гарантий безопасности не будет больше ни у кого. Кто от этого пострадает больше всего? Люди. Кто этого не хочет больше всего? Люди. Кто может этого не допустить? Люди.
Hours later, on February 24th, Putin launched a full-scale invasion in Ukraine.
Специальный военный операция.
World leaders have spoken out against Russia's invasion.
Condemn this barbaric attack and the cynical arguments to justify it.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin chose this war. and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
Anti-war protests have broken out around the world, including in Russia, despite the risk of arrest. Neighboring nations have opened their borders as hundreds and thousands of Ukrainians attempt to flee. NATO's response force has been activated for the first time in history, and the US has sent additional troops to Eastern Europe. But in many ways, the world is treading carefully. Putin actually controls the world's largest arsenal of nuclear weapons and has already threatened anyone who might interfere.
Кто бы ни пытался помешать, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались.
So countries around the world are imposing some of the harshest economic sanctions to slow Putin down. And the countries are also sending tons of military aid to support Ukraine. For now, Russian forces keep pushing deeper, but Ukraine is fighting back.
Захищаємо нашу незалежність, нашу державу. І так буде й далі.